All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another video. Well, in this particular video, it's going to be a bit more ad hoc, but it's going to follow a particular, I guess, article or write-up thread or whatever that I wrote on the new Dressless community forums. I'll put that link in the description below, but this is kind of going to be a precursor to my DUPA video that I'm going to be releasing sometime in the future. I know I've been talking about this for a while now in my community posts, but I felt like before I start, I should do something for the members of this channel, and I should just kind of give a brief overview of some of my ideas and thoughts when it comes to diffuse unpatterned alopecia and even retrograde alopecia or hair loss. Now, the main point of this is that diffuse unpatterned alopecia or DUPA and retrograde alopecia, I see them more so as aesthetic variations of perhaps androgenetic alopecia, but also they could have other underlying issues, right? So I guess let me try to, I don't know, clarify this a bit more. DUPA and retrograde are aesthetics, right? Where you can have somebody who has DUPA, and that cause of DUPA could be androgenetic alopecia, because we know there's various patterns when it comes to androgenetic alopecia. But however, DUPA finds itself in other conditions, right? It can be telogen effluvium, but it could also be some other serious conditions as well, like scarring alopecias, right? So you have this whole thing where aesthetics is masking the histological features of maybe the biopsy itself, right? So I use this sort of example, right? So you can imagine two people that have a missing hand, right? And the outward appearance, it might seem like they have the same, issue, right? They're both missing a hand, but the underlying causes are different significantly, right? In one person, it's a congenial defect, meaning that they were born without having that particular limb, their hand, maybe it's missing, right? When you look at the x-ray features, you don't see any sort of scarring around the muscles that surround the bone. You don't see any sort of signs of trauma. Whereas in another person, that missing limb, the same missing limb, analogous to the other person's body. So there, let's say also the right hand of another person, uh, you can see that probably it was amputated, right? If you do an X-ray. So essentially, their outward appearance seems the same. They are both missing, let's say, their right hand, but they have different underlying causes. And that sort of, I guess, framework can be kind of transposed to hair loss when it comes to hair loss conditions, right? So over here, you can see the various scales, different types of AGA scales, as well as female pattern hair loss scales. So those are there. But this is why scalp biopsies are pretty important, because when it comes to scalp biopsy, it involves removing a small tissue sample from the scalp, and then it's sent to a lab for more detailed examination. And this is really crucial for accurate diagnoses. And despite creating a minor scar in the area when the biopsies occurred, these biopsies are invaluable because they provide information that can't be gathered from just visual examination alone. So you can see signs of inflammation. Maybe you can see macrophages. You can probably see some sort of fibrosis in the tissue that you biopsy, which is scarring. But also, you could possibly see other crucial details like perhaps lymphocytes, these white blood cells, lymphocytic infiltrate of certain parts of the hair follicle structure, right? And that can tell you what's actually going on. If you see lymphocytic infiltrate around the, let's say, the sebaceous glands, that could indicate that somebody has lichen planopilaris, LPP. This is a pretty serious scarring alopecia. And you can possibly see that the stem cell bulge area is being destroyed by the lymphocytes. So when anything is being destroyed, or a tissue or some organ is being targeted by white blood cells in the body, you can think of that as an autoimmune condition. So lichen planopilaris, this autoimmune condition, is targeting sebaceous glands and destroying them. right? Um, and this is why having a biopsy is very important. Um, in my interview that I did with Dr. William Rassman, there was a portion when we were talking about diffuse and pattern alopecia. He mentioned how uh, some of his colleagues at other clinics, they actually make it a practice to biopsy everyone that comes in, or most people that come in, especially men, because it seems as if when it comes to lichen planopilaris, originally it was thought of being um, mostly affecting postmenopausal women. And for me, when I look at that, when I look at some of the studies, it seems as if there's some sort of a selection bias going on here, right? Um, there's this one study over here. I'm not sure if you guys can see the screen. I'm not even looking at OBS while I'm doing this. So I probably should later on. If not, I'll just edit it in. But it says in this study called, quote, Lichen planopilaris in Women, a retrospective review of 232 women seen at Mayo Clinic from 1992 to 2016 by Sydney C. Larkin et al., right? Um, what I was concerned about this, what about this study concerned me because there was a portion of the study that essentially stated, um, yeah, we're not worried about when it comes to men. We want to specifically focus on hormonal issues when it comes to hair loss. And at least the way they phrased it, it sounded as if they were saying hormonal issues were more significant in women, and thus it was more by just examining women, you can have a more accurate picture. So I actually stated over here, it says, quote, men were excluded from this study to more accurately determine the association of hormonal factors in LPP pathogenesis. So this exclusion is removing us from knowing the possibilities of any sort of potential histological differences that LPP may present in males or, you know, or females, right? Females who aren't postmenopausal. But it's really strange to phrase it that way. We want to see the hormonal factors in lichen planopilaris pathogenesis. So it's already coming with the assumption that lichen planopilaris only affects women or affects women to a significant extent. So by just solely examining women, you'll be able to make, I guess, a more accurate relation between hormonal factors and this particular autoimmune condition. And I think that's completely rife with bias because I want you guys to think about this, right? When a guy walks into some sort of a clinic complaining about hair loss, there, it's like whatever, right? We see bald men all the time. It's a normal thing. We may not like being bald ourselves or losing our hairs ourselves, but it's a somewhat expected and more acceptable occurrence when it happens in men, right? So rarely does it trigger signs for, oh, you need to get a biopsy. However, when you see hair loss in women, especially postmenopausal women, you're thinking all sorts of things, right? Like, oh, is it polycystic ovarian syndrome? Is it a pituitary issue? Is it a thyroid issue? So all of these questions, because it's not really typical, right, in society to see women who are losing their hair, right? And because it's not typical, because it's an atypical occurrence, even though androgenetic alopecia, when it comes to hair loss, is the most common cause of hair loss for both men and women, um, it still makes some physicians, it prompts them to investigate further, right? And because it prompts them to investigate further, it causes them to order more biopsies for women, especially postmenopausal women. So when it comes to particular conditions, it's kind of like the bias is inevitably going to state that only women of this particular demographic get this condition because, well, you're only biopsying women of that particular demographic. So, what I'm trying to say is essentially, sorry for my voice crack, essentially, it's very much underreported, right? It's an underreported condition in men because of this particular bias. So that's why the title of this whole thing that I have here is if you have DUPA, please read this. Everyone should be scalp biopsied because I think it really is important, right? And it's important because when you have one autoimmune condition, you're likely to have another autoimmune condition, right? Even though this is a hair loss condition, and this is why the whole just shave it, bro thing is kind of worrying. If you find out your hair loss issues is due to an autoimmune condition, right? You could be asymptomatic for another one. You could be carrying another autoimmune condition, right? So it's very important to actually inquire about your states of hair loss aside from the, you wanting to keep your aesthetics, right? It's in many cases it could be a sign of failing health, right? Um, this particular study that I said over here, the incidence, prevalence, and co-occurrence of autoimmune disorders over time by age, sex, and socioeconomic status, a population-based cohort study of 22 million individuals in the UK. By where is it? Did I even put it over here? Yeah, there we go. So with autoimmune conditions, you have higher risks of developing other ones. So over here, with individuals with childhood onset type 1 diabetes, they had a significant rate of Addison's disease and other sort of issues like thyroid issues as well, right? And if you go back to the LPP study that the Mayo Clinic did, they talked about, these women having essentially other comorbid issues, right? Aside from nutrition and uh, I guess depression, they had thyroid issues, right? They had just I think they had issues with diabetes as well, type 2 diabetes. So, or sorry, type 1 diabetes. I think some of the women had type 1 diabetes in that particular study. So it's important, right? You have one autoimmune condition, it could be a predisposing factor for another one. So this whole concept of you know, it just being hair loss, it's not completely true, right? You want to inquire about what that hair loss is, and it's really sad because this whole lichen planipilaris thing could be more common than we realize, and it could be affecting more people than we realize, right? And for some people who have been using something like dutasteride or finasteride, I'm going to be, honest with you. You can have androgenetic alopecia along with lichen planipilaris, but dutasteride isn't going to help your issue, right? It's not going to make the lichen planipilaris stop. It's not going to burn it out. The lymphocytes are still going to be targeting your sebaceous glands and destroying it. And that's an early sign of scarring alopecias. Um, so yeah, this is my write up. You guys, if you want to check it out, I'll put the link in the description. Um, but yeah, like when it comes to scarring alopecias and the immune system, there's this thing called immune privilege. So in certain parts of your body, you have these sort of signaling proteins that tell your immune system, "Hey, don't attack us. Don't attack us because we're part of the body." But when you lose that immune privilege, right, that makes that piece of tissue susceptible for destruction by your immune system because your immune system thinks, "Holy crap, what is this thing doing here? This is obviously an enemy. Let's kill it." I guess that's the cartoonish way of me putting it. But yeah, over here, I put some biopsies of lichen planipilaris. This is a key feature. I think they call this the goggles, right? But all these small little dots that you see floating around, these are lymphocytes, right? And the lymphocytes are going into the sebaceous glands. I'm pretty sure these are hair follicles over here. And yeah, I may be wrong. Wait, I think these are hair follicles, right? In any case, uh, the lymphocytes are targeting these tissue structures, the sebaceous glands, and they're destroying it. And in so destroying the sebaceous glands, this creates an early sign of a scarring alopecia. And then what soon follows is the destruction of the hair follicle dermopapilla structure. And over here, you can see the whole hair follicle itself. This thing over here has been replaced with fibrosis, with scarring. And that's, once you have a scar there, the hair is not going to grow out at all. And these are, other conditions, right? Frontal fibrosing alopecia. It's a variant of lichen planipilaris, central centrifugal cicatricial alopecia, or CCCA, that mostly affects women of African descent. But it also essentially has the same histological features of lichen planipilaris. The thing that mostly differentiates these conditions is that when you look at the patient itself, sorry, when you look at the patients themselves, sorry about that, they I guess their lichen planipilaris can show differently, right? So with FFA lichen planipilaris, it shows up at the front of the hairline and sometimes the eyebrows, and with just uh CCCA, it can be in the middle of the scalp. But also you have this thing called like pattern lichen planipilaris, right? Where it follows a frontal temporal recession pattern. It can kind of mimic androgenetic alopecia, right? So that's something that's also worrying as well. You can have lichen planipilaris that looks like typical patterns of androgenetic alopecia. So that's something to consider. Um, and this is why a biopsy would be important. It would be very invaluable, right? You need to do the biopsy to see what you actually have, and that can determine the type of treatment you need, right? And I guess in this part of, I guess, the video, we can talk about some of the thoughts when it comes to why some people might get lichen planipilaris or other forms of scarring alopecia. Now, the reason why I'm talking about scarring alopecia is because when you get a strange hair loss pattern, like a DUPA or a retrograde or something that's very, very spotty on the scalp, it could be something other than androgenetic alopecia, right? It could be like folliculitis. Maybe not folliculitis decalvans proper, because this is a really destructive sort of form of folliculitis, but you could have seborrheic dermatitis, seborrheic alopecia, right? You could have something else. So this is why a biopsy would be important. But going back to lichen planipilaris, it could manifest in diffuse kind of patterns, right? That mimics DUPA, that gives the aesthetic appearance of DUPA. And in order to know how to, I guess, somewhat treat that particular condition, I'm going to skip ahead in the write up a bit, but we have to look at um, where did I put it? Give me 1 second. Did I write it here? Um, you have to look at this thing called a PPAR. So yeah, there's this thing called PPAR receptors, right? Particularly PPAR gamma, and there's some emerging evidence that suggests that the dysfunction of PPAR gamma receptors in the sebaceous glands leads to a toxic lipid accumulation, causing inflammation and scarring alopecias. Now, PPAR gamma is a type of PPAR receptor that's responsible for lipid metabolism, breaking down lipids in local areas. And actually, when it's downregulated, when it's not working properly, it causes lipids to build up, right? And this is why there are medications, and they're typically used in diabetes, type 2 diabetes treatment, particularly, to kind of ameliorate the conditions of lichen planipilaris. And these are PPAR PPAR gamma agonist, not antagonist. So an agonist actually upregulates the activity of these receptors, and it causes them to kind of work again, right? Work and metabolize the local lipid environment. Because when you have too much of triglycerides and cholesterol, these are the lipids in question that we're concerned about, when they're in the skin at a high rate, it can lead to fibrosis. And I don't want to make this video more about other things, but we see this in other conditions like atherosclerosis, um, where when you have this buildup of these lipids, it can destroy the arteries, right? The arterial walls. But also in other conditions that could affect the liver as well, right? When the liver can't deal with the fats and the cholesterol, triglycerides, these two things in particular, If there's too much of it, it can lead to fibrosis of the tissue, right? So this is a really important thing. So when I think about this, um, it seems like, at least to me, when there's an excessive amount of lipid in the extracellular matrix of a particular tissue structure, if that lipid can't be removed, a toxic buildup incurs. Then the immune system comes in, attempts to do something, right? And in the process of it doing something, it leads to an inflammatory aspect, and that inflammatory aspect can destroy the tissue, and that tissue becomes fibrotic or scarred. And carrying that to the hair follicles, that's not good. So PPAR gamma agonists, an agonist upregulates a receptor. It's given to the patient sometimes, and there have been some case studies where there's moderate success there, right? Um, what I find to be particularly, I guess, interesting, there was a post on Reddit a couple weeks ago that was talking about it was from some researcher, I forgot his name. Um, I think it's over here, right? But you can read my write up about it. I'm not going to get too much into it. But essentially, the researcher was talking about how, oh, the Western diet causes androgenetic alopecia. The Western diet causes the quote unquote bald phenotype in androgenetic alopecia because of its high glycemic and high cholesterol and low mineral content. I don't think that's a good way of looking at it, right? I think that, okay, maybe it can contribute to androgenetic alopecia becoming slightly worse, and I'll touch on that in a moment, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's causing it, right? If you have PPAR gamma receptors that can't properly metabolize excessive lipids in, let's say, the human organism that has AGA, and also maybe a genetic predisposition to a lichen planipilaris because maybe at baseline their PPAR gamma receptors aren't working properly. And this can manifest in other conditions like having acne vulgaris as well, right? Then it suggests that, okay, sugar diets may trigger uh, your AGA in an aspect. Okay, maybe not trigger, but it could um it could make it worse, right? But it doesn't mean it's causing AGA, right? It could lead to a more toxic buildup of lipids, which could, if you have PPAR receptor issues, that could make your hair loss overall worse, and that could lead to other conditions that are um, more so scarring, right? In terms of its alopecia progression. So you have two conditions, maybe a lichen planipilaris triggered by some sort of high sugar diet, or maybe it's made worse. But I don't necessarily think that the sugar itself um, would be causing AGA. If you have AGA, we already know that's due to a uh, sensitivity to DHT, right? Your hair follicles are literally programmed to shrink, to die off when it comes in contact with DHT. But an interesting aspect of this that I think the researcher of that particular paper didn't really look into is the fact that we already know that DHT alone can cause significant issues with tissues, right? Especially sebaceous glands. We know that DHT can upregulate the production of sebum from sebaceous glands. So if the sebaceous glands increases its metabolic activity and it's producing more sebum, that can lead to a toxic accumulation of, you guessed it, high cholesterol. Sorry, I said high cholesterol. I guess, yeah, high cholesterolic content in the tissue, as well as high triglycerides in the tissue itself. And that is a recipe for conditions like acne, right? And seborrheic dermatitis. High cholesterol and high triglycerides. And if that's the case, if you're getting that sort of those two high lipids, right, it kind of becomes toxic, and it's already becoming toxic in the sense that one, it's feeding the local environment, the microbes involved with producing an acne type or a seborrheic dermatitis kind of condition. but also it's triggering the immune system to cause an inflammatory response in the tissue. If DHT is causing the sebaceous glands to overproduce in these sorts of lipids, and an individual already has some sort of defect with their PPAR gamma receptor, and there are other receptors too. I'm not going to focus on the other ones. I'm just going to focus on PPAR gamma. There's PPAR alpha and I think beta as well. And there's like 3 versions of PPAR gamma, but let's just focus on PPAR gamma. If DHT causes that excessive toxic lipid to accumulate, right, in the tissue, then guess what? If your PPAR gamma doesn't work properly, then it could trigger lichen planopilaris. It could trigger other forms of hair loss. And it could make it worse. It could make your overall hair loss worse, right? So I actually talked about this. It's kind of crazy, right? I talked about this around a year ago. And I'm kind of happy that I've been able to come full circle on the matter because to me, it goes to show how, I'm open to the idea that there are more contributing factors to someone's AGA getting worse. And I'm willing to bet that it has to do with maybe a defect in some people when it comes to their PPAR receptors, right? In their tissues. And like I said, we've seen this in other forms of scarring alopecia. One thing I do think that is interesting here is that end-stage androgenetic alopecia, creates scar tissue in that area, right? So I think eventually, when the hair follicle is kind of dying off, right? It has to be there has to be some sort of interplay with the immune system that kind of says, okay, this thing is starting to lose features of it being part of this body, so let's kind of destroy it, right? And replace it with scar tissue. And I think about maybe frostbite, right? Over time, if you have severe frostbite where your hand is pretty much kind of dead, right? Then the immune system kind of comes there and kind of like sections off that dying tissue, and eventually the fingers kind of fall off. If you have frostbite on your fingertips, those fingers turn black. Over time, they fall off, but usually physicians amputate it because they don't want you to get any sort of sepsis. But kind of straying away from the point here, there has to be some sort of interplay, in my opinion, where the immune system eventually comes to a dying hair follicle and tells it, yeah, we got to get rid of you, right? And I think because DHT targets the derma papilla cells, right? There's something that's going on there that, it causes the derma papilla to shrink over time. And I think in that area, because you're having all sorts of factors where the Wnt pathway is being downregulated in certain aspects and upregulated in negative inflammatory aspects, that it could be conceivable that the cells in that particular area, the derma papilla, loses its immunoprivileges at some point in time, and that causes the immune system to come in, lymphocytic infiltrate the lymphocytes, come in, and then they destroy that piece of tissue, and it, again, fibrosis sets in, and it's replaced with scar tissue. So these are just some ideas that I've been thinking about. Maybe I'll put it into a better video where I can be a bit more organized. But yeah, like if you do a biopsy and you find out that you have lichen planopilaris or a form of lichen planopilaris, then that is definitely invaluable, right? Okay, so you lose about 40 hairs in the process of you doing the biopsy, but then you can kind of forecast what can happen to 100,000 or more hairs on your scalp. And that's the important aspect here, right? So, very important, something that you should consider, especially if you're getting quote unquote worse on treatment, worse on dutasteride, for example. And it also can show you other issues that may not be entirely end of the world when it comes to hair loss. You could have folliculitis. Maybe not folliculitis decalvans. Folliculitis decalvans, typically, if that sets in, it's extreme. It causes a scar in that area. Um, but if you just have regular folliculitis, which in and of itself can cause hair loss, even if it's a mild form of folliculitis that's chronic, that can cause hair loss over time, right? You can have maybe just regular folliculitis, but if it's chronically affecting you, it can cause chronic telogen effluvium, or it can actually, again, if it's chronic, meaning over time, it can cause some forms of scar tissue to form, and that can be deleterious to your hair. So it's important to actually know what's going on and get the proper treatment. But yeah, we're getting to the bottom of the iceberg here when it comes to talking about these conditions, and there's not much for me to say. So if you're interested about reading this entire thing, I'll put it in the description below. And again, thank you guys for the support I've been getting on this channel. And I'm thinking about expanding this channel to other things, talking about chronic pain. I have a friend of mine, he has been dealing with it himself, but he's been doing a lot of research into the chronic pain field. And maybe I'll have him on at one point in time and we can talk about it. But yeah, thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I appreciate you, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye, guys.